We gotta keep pressing on.
His plan to increase his profits by running the...
For years, Marty Meierotto's isolated Yukon shelter stood as a symbol of pure wilderness grit, a place known only to seasoned trappers, bush pilots, and those who understood the unforgiving silence of the far north. Built with his own hands and tucked deep within miles of frozen timber, Marty's shelter had weathered storms, blizzards, and the kind of brutal cold that could snap steel. It was more than a refuge. It was a lifeline in a land where one wrong decision could mean never returning home. But recently, when a routine winter flyover noticed something unusual, no smoke from the chimney, no tracks, no sign of movement around the shelter, concern spread quickly. Friends and fellow outdoorsmen knew Marty's habits. They knew his rhythms. Something felt off, and when a small team finally pushed through the Yukon's deadly cold to reach his remote cabin, they walked into a scene none of them were prepared for. What they discovered inside was not just unexpected, it was heartbreaking. The shelter, normally neatly organized and stocked for long winter stretches, looked as if time itself had frozen mid-moment. Tools were untouched. Supplies remained sealed. A set of snowshoes lay by the door, as if waiting for someone who never returned. And deeper inside, a personal item, one only Marty would have left behind, raised even more questions, sending a wave of dread through the group. As word spread, speculation exploded. Was Marty in trouble? Had something forced him to abandon the shelter he relied on for survival? Or was the truth something far more tragic than anyone wanted to believe? The Yukon is a place that keeps its secrets well, but this discovery, silent and chilling, has shaken everyone who knows Marty's story and hints at a reality far more devastating than the wilderness alone could deliver. The Yukon has always been a land that speaks softly, its voice carried on the wind, in the whisper of snowdrifts, in the distant creak of ice splitting under its own weight. For those who lived out here, like Marty Meierotto, silence wasn't something to fear. It was something to understand, something that revealed more than it hid. For nearly 3 decades, Marty had listened to that silence. He could read it better than most people could read a map. He knew when a storm was coming, when wolves were close, when the rivers were shifting beneath their frozen skins. The wilderness wasn't separate from him. It was part of his blood. That is why the silence felt wrong. It began with something small, so small that most people would never think twice about it. During a scheduled winter flyover, pilot Dennis Harrell circled the remote stretch of land where Marty's shelter should have been, a tiny dot of life among endless white. Dennis had flown this route for years, dropping supplies when roads iced over, checking for signs of trouble among trappers who preferred isolation over civilization. Usually, Marty's shelter showed at least one sign of movement, a thin ribbon of smoke from the wood stove, fresh snowshoe tracks leading toward the creek, or the glint of a shovel propped against the outer wall. But this time, there was nothing. Dennis radioed in, not with panic, but with a quiet unease. "Shelter looks empty," he said. "No heat, no tracks, not even last week's." The words were simple, but the silence that followed on the radio frequency spoke louder. Marty wasn't unpredictable. He wasn't careless, and he certainly wasn't the type to abandon his shelter in the dead of winter without leaving signs of where he'd gone. That was the unspoken rule of the Yukon. You always left signs. Tracks, notes, smoke, anything that said, "I'm alive." When Dennis landed back in Fort Yukon, he found a small group already gathering, people who'd known Marty for years. Men who respected him enough not to jump to conclusions, but understood the stakes well enough to take every silence seriously. Among them was Cole Atwater, a longtime friend and occasional trapping partner. Cole had spent countless nights in that shelter with Marty, waiting out storms while the temperature outside dropped low enough to freeze bare skin in seconds. He knew the place as well as he knew his own home. "Maybe he's checking a trapline farther out," one of the men suggested. Cole shook his head. Not without leaving tracks. Not after a fresh snow. A decision was made without much debate. They would assemble a small team, pack light, and take the snowmobiles as far as possible before switching to snowshoes. The weather forecast showed a narrow window, 30 hours before another storm rolled in. If Marty needed help, every hour counted. The journey was brutal, even for seasoned outdoorsmen. The wind clawed at their faces, snowdrifts hit uneven ground, and the temperature hovered dangerously close to levels where even heavy gear offered little protection. But the men pushed on, driven not by duty but by loyalty. As the shelter finally came into view, half buried in snow, its wooden roof frosted white, they stopped. There was no movement, no smoke, no sound except the wind pressing against the trees. Cole swallowed hard. "Let's go." They approached slowly, as if afraid to disturb something sacred. The front steps, usually swept clean even in harsh weather, were covered in untouched snow. The doorknob was rimmed with frost. It took effort to force it open. Inside, the cold hit them like a wall. The air was still, heavy with the unmistakable chill of a place that hadn't been warmed for days. Their breath fogged instantly. Cole stepped forward first. His boots echoed softly on the wooden floor. Everything looked frozen in time. The tools near the workbench were neatly hung, untouched. The firewood stack was full. Marty's bed was made, blankets tucked with the same precision he always used. A pot hung over the cold stove, still half filled with water that had turned to solid ice. But it was the small personal belongings, a worn glove on the table, Marty's knife sheath lying open, a notebook resting half-finished that made Cole's chest tighten. "Marty wouldn't leave like this," he whispered. The others said nothing. They felt it too. Something was off, deeply, horribly off, and none of them were ready for what they would discover next. For a long moment, the men simply stood inside the frozen shelter, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Every detail felt wrong. The Yukon was harsh, but Marty Meierotto was tougher. He didn't make mistakes. He didn't forget to light the stove. He didn't abandon full stacks of firewood. And he certainly didn't leave food, tools, and warm clothing untouched. Survival in the North left no room for carelessness, especially from someone who had spent his entire adult life mastering this land. Cole ran a gloved hand across the table, brushing a thin layer of frost from the surface. "This place hasn't seen heat in at least a week," he murmured, his voice tight. "Maybe longer." Dennis nodded slowly. He had flown the area 10 days earlier and had seen nothing alarming then. "If something happened," he said carefully, "it was after my last pass." They began a methodical search of the interior, not because they expected to find Marty there if he were inside. They would have known the moment they opened the door, but because they needed answers, anything. A sign, a note, a clue. The first thing they noticed was the Traplin notebook, still open on the table where Cole had seen Marty write dozens of times before. The last entry was dated 7 days prior and described routine checks, no warnings, no strange animal behavior, no mention of weather concerns. Just clean, steady handwriting detailing the daily rhythm of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Except for one small detail. Cole spotted it first. A single line of writing at the bottom of the page, so faint he almost missed it beneath the frost. "Heard something last night. Unusual. We'll check tomorrow." Cole felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Heard something?" he whispered. "What does that mean?" Dennis frowned. "Wolves, ice shifting? Maybe just wind." Cole shook his head. "Marty doesn't write notes for the obvious. If he put it down, it meant something." The men exchanged uneasy looks. They moved next to the storage shelves, checking for missing gear. Nothing had been taken, not the emergency radio, not the spare fuel, not even the extra snowshoes. Everything was in place, untouched. If Marty had left voluntarily, even for a short distance, he would have taken at least one essential item, but he hadn't. That was when Jack Turner, the youngest of the group, spotted something odd near the back wall. "Hey, what about this?" He knelt in front of a small square hatch that led beneath the shelter, an access point Marty used for storing gear that needed to stay cold but dry. The hatch door was cracked open an inch, just enough to let in a whisper of icy air. "That's not right," Cole muttered, hurrying over. "Marty always locks this shut from the inside." Jack tugged the hatch upward. It groaned, stiff with frozen moisture. Cole leaned over to peer inside, expecting to find a stash of tools or sealed crates. Instead, he found something that made his breath stop. A single boot print perfectly preserved in the frost-covered boards below the shelter. It wasn't one of theirs, and it wasn't Marty's. The tread was wrong, too narrow, too deep, too sharp at the heel. Whoever made it had stepped hard, as if landing from a jump or struggling to keep balance. And the direction was toward the opposite hatch, the one that led outside. Someone was under here, Dennis said quietly, his voice barely above the wind outside. Recently, Jack swallowed. Someone hiding? Cole didn't answer. He climbed down through the hatch, boots thudding softly against the frozen planks. He traced the print with his fingers, feeling its edges with the careful precision of a man who had read tracks his entire life. Not Marty, he finally said. Wrong size. Wrong. It did, Cole replied. This isn't the print. This is where someone stepped after brushing snow off a branch. Pattern's faint, but the weight's right. Someone tried to cover their tracks literally. Jack felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. Why hide the tracks? Cole didn't answer. He didn't need to. In the Yukon, men only hid traces for two reasons: to avoid being found, or because they had done something they didn't want discovered. The three men continued their loop round the shelter. About 50 yards out, they found the next sign, a patch of disturbed snow surrounded by broken twigs. Something or someone had knelt there, maybe to adjust gear, maybe to listen, maybe to watch. This isn't random, Cole said quietly. Someone was waiting here, watching the cabin, waiting for Marty. Dennis asked. Cole considered it. Or waiting for him to leave. They pressed on, fanning out just enough to sweep the nearby tree line. The sky above them was a dull sheet of winter gray, the kind that swallowed sunlight and made the forest feel endless. If the unknown bootprint had been left only 3 or 4 days ago, the person responsible couldn't have gone far, not on foot, not through this terrain. Jack stopped suddenly. Guys, you'll want to see this. He was standing over a cluster of snow-laden branches that formed a shallow depression. Cole hurried over and knelt beside it. A camp, small, temporary, hidden. The remains of a fire pit were barely visible beneath a layer of snow, but the char at the base was fresh enough to suggest it had been used recently after Dennis's last flyover. Cole's jaw tightened. Whoever stayed here didn't want to be seen. No large fire, no shelter, just enough heat to survive the night. Dennis scanned the surrounding trees uneasily. They camped here, watched the shelter, then went inside when Marty wasn't around, or when he was, Jack said, the thought hanging heavily in the air. Cole stood, brushing snow from his gloves. There's something else. He pointed to a narrow gap between 2 birch trees. The snow was disturbed there, too barely noticeable, but enough for an expert to read. Those are drag marks, Cole said. Jack swallowed. Like someone pulling a sled? Not wide enough, Cole replied. More like a person. Someone was dragged through here. Silence fell again, colder than the wind. The trail led deeper into the woods. Not far, maybe 100 yards. Then it disappeared under a snowbank where the storm had wiped everything clean. We need to follow it, Dennis said. Cole nodded. We will. But before they could move, Jack pointed toward the tree at the edge of the drag marks. There, pinned to the bark with the tip of a knife blade, was a piece of torn fabric, faded, rough, recognizable. Marty's coat. The color hit Cole like a punch. He took it in his hands, examining the rip, the frayed edges, the flecks of frozen blood clinging to the fibers. Marty didn't leave this here, he said, voice hollow. The truth was no longer avoidable. Something had happened, and whatever it was, it had started right outside this shelter. For a long moment, none of the men spoke. The torn piece of Marty's coat fluttered slightly in the wind, pinned to the birch tree like a grim signpost left behind on purpose. Cole turned it over in his gloved hands, studying the frayed tear. The fibers were stiff with frost, but the blood dark, frozen into the folds, told its own unmistakable story. Marty didn't lose this in an accident, Cole said quietly. Something ripped it off him. Jack exhaled shakily. So he fought, or tried to escape, Dennis added. The forest around them felt suddenly different. Not just cold, not just quiet, watchful, as if the trees themselves remembered what had happened here. Cole tucked the fabric safely into his jacket. We follow the drag marks. Whatever happened to Marty? The answers are deeper in those woods. They formed a tight line, moving carefully along the faint trail. The snow was uneven here, packed in strange patterns that hinted at a struggle before the storm buried most of it. Branches were bent in places, some snapped clean. As if someone or the people had forced their way through in haste, the deeper they went, the more oppressive the silence became. The sound of their own breathing seemed too loud, their footsteps too sharp. Even wildlife stayed hidden. The Yukon was holding its breath. Cole stopped every few yards to scan the ground, then the trees, reading the landscape the same way others read a book. He crouched near a fallen log, brushing away a thin crust of snow. A smear of frozen blood crossed the wood, faint but unmistakable. He was hurt, Cole murmured. But he kept moving. Jack swallowed. Dragged or walked. Cole hesitated. Both, looks like. Someone tried to make him walk. When he couldn't, they dragged him. Dennis's face tightened. Why take him alive? Cole didn't answer. Not because he didn't know, but because the possibilities were too dark to speak aloud. The trail led them to the base of a steep ridge. The slope rose sharply, dusted with snow that had settled over rough patches of rock and ice. At first, it looked like the trail vanished here to another dead end swallowed by the storm. But Cole's instincts didn't allow him to accept that. He scanned the rocks, then pointed. There, half hidden behind a boulder, lay a narrow crevice, just wide enough for a man to be shoved through. Snow inside the opening was disturbed, melted slightly from human warmth before refreezing into uneven ripples. Jack stared. They took him. In there. Dennis stepped closer and shined his flashlight into the darkness. The beam revealed a shallow cave, no more than 10 feet deep. Its interior walls jagged and shadowed. Tracks, Dennis said. Fresh before the snow. Cole motioned for caution. Someone used this place. Maybe to hide. Maybe to wait. They stepped inside, the crunch of ice under their boots echoing softly off stone. The cave smelled faintly of smoke-old smoke and something else beneath it. Something metallic. Cole knelt beside a corner, brushing away a thin pile of debris. His hand froze when he saw it. A spent rifle casing. Jack's breath hitched. That's Marty's caliber. Cole picked it up, turning it in the light. The metal was clean, not weather-worn. Fired recently within days. He fired a shot, Cole said quietly. Here from inside the cave. Dennis swept the light across the floor. But at who or what? They found the answer moments later. Near the back of the cave, lying half buried in snow and dirt, was another piece of evidence. A set of boot impressions, small, deep, sharp-treaded. The same tread they had seen under the shelter, and next to those prints. A second casing. Cole inhaled sharply. Someone shot back. Jack whispered. It was a firefight. Dennis moved the flashlight slowly, revealing more disturbed snow, a scuff mark on the stone wall. Dried blood droplets trailing toward the cave entrance. Marty didn't die here, Cole said. He was taken from here. He was moved again. Jack's voice was barely audible. So the cave was just a stop, a struggle, a last stand. Cole stood, eyes narrowed, jaw set with new determination. This isn't an accident. This isn't a wild animal. Someone came out here, found Marty, took him, and covered their trail. He turned toward the ridge, the direction the drag marks pointed after leaving the cave, and they went that way. The three men stepped back into the cold, the cave behind them holding its secrets like a frozen grave. For the first time since entering the forest, Cole felt it, not just fear, but the presence of something still out there, waiting, watching. And the real heartbreak was only beginning.